We march to Tiberias. God will protect the kingdom.
This road is death. The army needs water, not pride. A king who hesitates loses the cross.
Cut the water! Burn the scrub! Let thirst fight for us!
On the 4th of July, 1187 AD, the largest Crusader army ever assembled in the Holy Land stood trapped on a waterless, double-peaked hill known as the Horns of Hattin. Beneath the blistering heat of the midsummer sun baking men alive inside their heavy iron chainmail, the survival of the Kingdom of Jerusalem hung by a thread. The impending destruction of this 20,000-strong Crusader force was not merely the result of superior enemy weapons, but of a catastrophic logistical paradox. King Guy of Lusignan had willingly marched his heavily armed knights away from abundant water and strong defensive positions, leading them directly onto a barren plateau surrounded by 30,000 of Saladin's troops. This single, fatal command failure would ultimately cost the Crusaders their entire field army, their king, and the Holy City itself. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today, we break down the disastrous tactical decisions, the deliberate weaponization of the desert environment, and the precise military execution by Saladin that permanently broke the power of the Crusader states. By 1187 AD, the geopolitical map of the Levant had fundamentally shifted. Salah ad-Din, known to the West as Saladin, had achieved what previous regional leaders could not, executing the strategic encirclement of the Crusader states. By uniting the vast agricultural wealth of Egypt with the military manpower of Syria under the Ayyubid administration, he forged a continuous hostile border around the Christian territories. Inside the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the political structure was simultaneously fracturing. The stabilizing presence of King Baldwin IV, who had successfully held Saladin at bay despite his severe leprosy, was gone. His death triggered a bitter, paralyzing succession crisis that split the European feudal lords into deeply entrenched rival factions. Out of this political vacuum emerged King Guy of Lusignan, a newly crowned monarch who possessed the title but lacked the inherent authority to command the absolute obedience of his barons. Guy found himself heavily dependent on a militant faction of hardliners to maintain his fragile grip on power. This aggressive bloc was driven by Raynald of Chatillon, the rogue lord of Ultra-Jourdain, and Gerard de Riedfort, the uncompromising Grand Master of the Knights Templar. Unlike the older generation of Crusader lords, who understood the strict necessity of pragmatic truces to survive in a heavily outnumbered region, this faction favored constant warfare. The peace holding the kingdom together was finally shattered when Raynald of Chatillon blatantly violated a standing treaty, launching a violent raid against a Muslim merchant caravan traversing his territory. This brazen attack provided Saladin with the absolute moral and political justification required to mobilize his empire. The Sultan declared a formal campaign, summoning a massive coalition force of 30,000 men. However, Saladin was a masterful logistician who clearly understood the structural realities of warfare in the Holy Land. He knew that engaging in prolonged grinding sieges against the towering stone fortresses of the Crusaders would slowly bleed his army dry and risk his fragile political coalition breaking apart. To dismantle the Kingdom of Jerusalem, he needed to annihilate its professional military class in a single decisive stroke. Saladin knew he could not defeat the Crusaders behind their walls, so he devised a strategic trap explicitly designed to force them into a fatal mistake out in the open, where the desert itself would become his primary weapon. On the 2nd of July 1187 AD, Saladin sprang that exact trap by laying siege to the citadel of Tiberias, located on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. Inside the fortress was Eshiva, the wife of Raymond III, Count of Tripoli. This was a highly calculated political provocation. Saladin knew that the Crusader army, numbering 20,000 men, was currently massed at the springs of Sephoria, 15 miles to the west. At Sephoria, the Christian forces held a perfect strategic position. They possessed abundant water, ample forage, and highly defensible terrain. If Saladin attacked them there, the Ayyubid army would face a heavily entrenched, well-supplied enemy. Instead, the Sultan intended to use Tiberias as bait to draw the Crusader heavy cavalry away from their vital water lines and out into the hostile environment of the Galilean summer. When news of the siege reached Sephoria, King Guy of Lusignan convened a midnight war council. The tactical reality was debated under the dim, flickering light of the royal command tent. Raymond III of Tripoli, the very man whose wife and city were currently under siege by Muslim forces, delivered a brutally pragmatic assessment. He argued unequivocally that the army must remain at Sephoria. To march 15 miles across an arid, waterless plateau at the height of July would be logistical suicide. Raymond explicitly told the king that he was willing to sacrifice his own wife, his retainers, and his citadel rather than risk the entire field army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in a desert march. It was the only strategically sound advice available, prioritizing the survival of the state over feudal pride. The council initially agreed to hold their ground, but medieval politics were driven by honor, factionalism, and the perception of courage. Later that night, Gerard de Rydefort, the Grand Master of the Templars and a bitter political rival of Raymond, sought a private audience with King Guy. Rydefort weaponized the new king's political insecurity. He accused Guy of cowardice, arguing that abandoning Tiberias would fatally undermine his newfound royal authority and make him look incredibly weak before his vassals. Rydefort demanded an immediate march to relieve the city, threatening the withdrawal of the elite Templar forces if the king refused. Guy, terrified of losing the support of his hardline faction and desperate to project strength, completely reversed the council's earlier decision. He abandoned logistical reality in favor of political face-saving. On the morning of July 3, the royal trumpets sounded the general advance. The largest Christian army ever assembled in the Levant abandoned their fortified encampment. Leaving behind the life-giving springs of Sephoria, the massive column of iron-clad men and heavy war horses stepped out onto a baked, barren plateau, initiating a march from which thousands of them would never return. The force that marched east from Sephoria was a masterpiece of medieval military engineering, representing the absolute martial peak of the Crusader states. Numbering roughly 20,000 men, its lethal core consisted of approximately 1,200 elite heavy knights drawn from the secular nobility and the formidable military orders of the Knights Templar and Hospitaller. Supporting this armored vanguard were 4,000 Turcopoles, native light cavalry employed for scouting and screening, along with a massive, highly disciplined block of spearmen and crossbowmen. The Crusaders operated under a strict combined arms tactical doctrine, functioning as a tightly integrated, slow-moving fortress. The infantry formed a cohesive outer wall, utilizing their large shields and heavy crossbows to absorb enemy missile fire and aggressively protect the highly vulnerable, unarmored war horses of the nobility. This defensive shell was designed to weather enemy harassment until the opposing lines overcommitted or fractured. At that precise tactical moment, the infantry ranks would seamlessly open, allowing the heavy cavalry to unleash a devastating shock charge that few armies in the medieval world could physically withstand. Opposing this armored juggernaut was Saladin's unified coalition of 30,000 men, a force constructed on an entirely divergent military philosophy. Rather than relying on the brute kinetic impact of a heavy charge, the Ayyubid army prioritized absolute operational mobility and sustained missile tactics. The Sultan commanded vast swarms of highly trained horse archers, heavily supported by rapid light cavalry and veteran infantry regiments from Egypt and Syria. Saladin's tactical doctrine was expressly engineered to dismantle the Crusader formation through relentless, calculated attrition. His horsemen were trained to rapidly close the distance, loose concentrated, overlapping volleys of arrows, and immediately wheel away before the European knights could ever close the gap to force a close-quarters melee. However, the true vulnerability of the Crusader war machine was not found in enemy weaponry, but in its own staggering metabolic demands. The system of mutual protection between infantry and cavalry was virtually unbreakable when executed correctly, yet it dictated an agonizingly slow marching pace. Maintaining tight ranks while wearing padded gambesons and heavy chainmail generated immense internal temperatures, turning the armor into an inescapable oven under the punishing July sun. This mechanical, grinding advance required massive, continuous supplies of water to prevent mass heat stroke and systemic physical collapse among both the men and the horses. On a conventional, well-watered battlefield near the coast, this Crusader formation was nearly invincible. But Saladin had absolutely no intention of fighting a conventional battle. He had lured them onto a barren, dusty plateau where he intended to let the sun do the killing. The march from Sephoria to Tiberias covered barely 15 miles, but it required crossing an exposed, arid plateau completely devoid of natural springs. Almost immediately after the Crusader vanguard stepped out of the protective terrain of the Sephorian hills, Saladin's forces initiated contact. Ayyubid horse archers did not attempt to block the road directly to force a pitched battle. Instead, they swarmed the flanks and specifically targeted the vulnerable Crusader rearguard, which was commanded by the Knights Templar and Balian of Ibelin. Utilizing their powerful composite bows, the Muslim light cavalry loosed continuous, overlapping volleys of arrows into the trailing ranks. This forced the Crusaders to frequently halt their advance, lock their shields, and attempt to repel the skirmishers. This hit-and-run doctrine was a precise logistical strike designed to bleed the marching column of its most critical resource, which was forward momentum. The strict tactical necessity of maintaining the protective infantry box around the heavy warhorses drastically reduced the army's overall pace. Under standard conditions, a professional force could cover 15 miles in a single day, but the relentless Ayyubid harassment slowed the Crusader column to an agonizing crawl. By mid-afternoon, the environment itself had been fully weaponized against them. The July sun beat down on 20,000 men wearing thick padded gambesons and heavy iron chainmail, trapping their body heat and turning their protective gear into physical burdens that rapidly accelerated dehydration. Furthermore, the sheer weight of thousands of marching men and horses trampling across the baked earth kicked up a dense, continuous cloud of dust that choked the soldiers and obscured their lines of sight. In desert warfare, time is intrinsically linked to water consumption. Every hour the Crusaders were delayed by Saladin's archers meant their limited, portable water skins were being drained faster than they could advance toward the Sea of Galilee. Discipline within the infantry ranks began to fray under the extreme physical and thermal stress. Men who were severely dehydrated could no longer march at the required pace, causing the tightly packed column to stretch out dangerously along the rocky plateau. The Templars in the rear guard were taking heavy casualties to their horses and repeatedly sent desperate messages forward to King Guy, pleading for the vanguard to halt so the rear could close the widening gap and prevent the army from being severed in two. As the late afternoon wore on and the sun began to dip toward the western horizon, the brutal geometry of Saladin's trap became undeniable. The Crusader vanguard was still miles away from the life-giving waters of Tiberias, while the rearguard was completely pinned down by continuous Ayyubid assaults. Faced with a fragmented column, exhausted men, and failing daylight, King Guy of Lusignan realized that pushing forward to the lake before nightfall was now physically impossible. Standing on the dry plateau, he was forced to issue a command that would permanently seal the fate of the entire kingdom of Jerusalem. Unable to push the fractured column any further through the gathering dusk, King Guy of Lusignan ordered the army to halt and make camp near the ruined, waterless village of Mascana. It was a command that defied every fundamental principle of survival in the Levantine landscape. Upon hearing the order to pitch tents on the dry, exposed plateau rather than fighting through to the lake, Raymond III of Tripoli reportedly rode to the king in despair, crying out that the war was over and the kingdom was finished. The Crusaders had effectively locked themselves inside a static perimeter with completely empty water skins, surrendering all remaining operational momentum to the enemy. Saladin recognized the fatal error immediately. As darkness fell over the Horns of Hattin, the Sultan did not order a chaotic night assault against the entrenched heavy infantry. Instead, he utilized the superior mobility of his Ayyubid coalition to execute a flawless encirclement. Thousands of light cavalry and infantry systematically closed the net, cutting off every potential avenue of retreat back to Sephoria and blocking every forward route to the Sea of Galilee. The Crusaders were no longer an advancing army. They were prisoners trapped within a rapidly tightening siege of their own making. With the trap secured, the Ayyubid command initiated a masterful campaign of psychological warfare designed to completely break the Crusaders' morale before dawn. Utilizing their secure supply lines to the nearby lake, Saladin ordered camel caravans heavily laden with fresh water to continuously resupply his forward lines. In a calculated display of environmental dominance, Ayyubid soldiers stepped just beyond the effective range of the European crossbows and deliberately emptied full skins of water into the parched, dusty earth. For the deeply dehydrated men trapped inside the Crusader lines, watching this life-saving resource soak into the sand while they suffered the agonizing physiological effects of severe thirst was a devastating mental blow. The overnight halt rapidly eroded the strict unit cohesion that the Crusader tactical doctrine relied upon. Without water, the human body cannot regulate its temperature, and men trapped in thick padded armor began to succumb to severe muscle cramps, delirium, and physical collapse. Compounding this physiological breakdown, Saladin ordered his troops to maintain a relentless, rhythmic barrage of drums and chanting throughout the darkness, ensuring that the exhausted Christian forces were entirely denied the restorative effects of sleep. By the time the sky began to lighten on the morning of the 4th of July, 1187 AD, the 20,000 men of the Crusader army were fractured, desperate, and driven nearly mad by thirst. They organized their lines to launch a suicidal push toward the springs of Hattin, completely unaware that Saladin had prepared one final suffocating weapon to break their formation forever. As the sun crested the eastern horizon on the morning of July 4, the desperate Crusader army began its agonizing push toward the springs of Hattin. The objective was barely a few miles away, but the Ayyubid vanguard securely blocked the descent to the water. Recognizing that the Christian forces were operating at the absolute limit of their physical endurance, Saladin unleashed a brilliant, lethal exploitation of the local geography. He noted the direction of the prevailing morning winds, sweeping across the arid plateau, and ordered his troops to set fire to the dense, parched scrub brush that blanketed the Galilean hills. The wind immediately caught the flames, driving a thick, suffocating wall of acrid black smoke directly into the faces of the advancing Crusaders. This weaponized smoke was the decisive catalyst that finally shattered the tactical integrity of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The fundamental premise of the Crusader combined arms doctrine, relying entirely on a slow, heavily armored box of infantry protecting the cavalry, required rigid unit cohesion and clear lines of sight. Blinded by the smoke, searing their lungs with every breath, and driven to the edge of madness by severe dehydration, the Christian infantry reached their psychological and physiological breaking point. The strict discipline that had held the army together for the previous 24 hours violently evaporated. Unable to endure the choking heat and the relentless barrage of Ayyubid arrows pouring through the haze, the Crusader infantry completely broke formation. Abandoning their protective positions around the knights, thousands of foot soldiers surged in a disorganized mass toward the only elevated terrain available, moving up the steep, rocky slopes of the double-peaked extinct volcano known as the Horns of Hattin. By scrambling up the high ground, they hoped to escape the smoke and the cavalry skirmishers, but in doing so, they severed the structural spine of the army. When King Guy of Lusignan and his commanders realized the defensive perimeter had collapsed, they sent desperate orders demanding the infantry return to the valley floor and reform the shield wall. The exhausted spearmen and crossbowmen simply refused, shouting down from the slopes that they were dying of thirst and would fight no more. This mass insubordination triggered an immediate tactical catastrophe. Without the protective screen of the infantry and their heavy crossbows to suppress enemy missile fire, the heavy cavalry of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was left entirely exposed on the open plateau. While the European knights themselves were heavily armored in chainmail and capable of absorbing glancing blows, their massive destriers, the highly trained war horses essential for the devastating heavy charge, were almost completely unarmored. Ayyubid horse archers recognized the vulnerability instantly. They closed the distance with absolute impunity, unleashing concentrated, continuous volleys of arrows aimed not at the riders but directly at their mounts. Within a matter of minutes, the primary offensive weapon of the Crusader states was systematically dismantled. The plateau was littered with thousands of war horses collapsing under the relentless Ayyubid missile fire, severely limiting the mobility of the commanders and pinning riders to the baked earth. The legendary shock power of the European heavy cavalry had been neutralized without a single major clash of lances. Stripped of their mobility, their infantry support, and their water supply, the surviving elite knights of Jerusalem were forced to trudge uphill in heavy armor to join the remnants of their mutinous army, preparing to make their final, desperate stand entirely on foot. With their primary combat system dismantled, King Guy of Lusignan and Reynald of Chatillon ordered a fighting retreat, consolidating the surviving nobility on the northern peak of the Horns of Hattin. Here, upon the barren volcanic rock, they pitched the Red Royal Tent to establish a final static command post. Beside the king stood the Bishop of Acre, bearing the true cross, the most sacred relic of the Crusader states. In the mechanics of medieval warfare, this relic functioned as far more than a spiritual artifact. It was the ultimate tactical rallying point, serving as the physical embodiment of the kingdom's legitimacy and resolve. Under the blinding glare of the midday sun reflecting off the red canvas, the remaining knights formed a tight, desperate perimeter. Not all of the Crusader leadership accepted this static defense. Raymond III of Tripoli, commanding a surviving contingent of vanguard cavalry, analyzed the collapsing geometry of the battlefield and ordered an immediate, high-speed breakout. Recognizing the sheer kinetic momentum of a heavy cavalry wedge, Saladin's commanders relied on standard Ayyubid counter-tactics, simply opening their ranks to let the charge through. Raymond's knights rushed into the void, passing through the Ayyubid lines without striking a decisive blow. The Muslim formation seamlessly closed the gap behind them, permitting the Count of Tripoli to escape the battlefield while permanently sealing the remaining Christian forces inside the trap. For King Guy and the trapped nobility, surrender was not a military option while the true cross remained on the field. In a final, brutal display of martial discipline, the dismounted knights and the few who still possessed warhorses launched two massive, concentrated charges directly downhill towards Saladin's personal command position. This was not an exercise in glorious heroism, but the grim terminal math of survival. Fighting in heavy iron chainmail at the peak of the Galilean afternoon, the Crusaders pushed through the Ayyubid lines with such desperate ferocity that they nearly breached the Sultan's personal guard before being physically repelled by the overwhelming numerical weight of the Muslim reinforcements. The sheer physical toll of dehydration, heat stroke, and exhaustion finally broke the Crusader assault. As the momentum of the second charge collapsed, Ayyubid infantry surged up the steep slopes of Hattin. In the ensuing close-quarters melee, the Bishop of Acre was killed, and the true cross was violently wrenched from Christian hands. From a military standpoint, the capture of the relic acted as a psychological decapitation strike. It instantly shattered the remaining Christian morale, completely erasing their organized will to resist. Moments later, the ropes of the red royal tent were cut, and the canvas collapsed to the dusty earth, signaling the absolute destruction of the field army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. King Guy, Reynold of Chatillon, and the surviving elite commanders were systematically disarmed and taken prisoner. Yet, while thousands of common soldiers were killed or marched into slavery on the Baked Plateau, the most historically significant consequence of the day would not happen on the battlefield, but hours later, inside the private confines of the Sultan's tent. Escorted away from the ruined army, King Guy of Lusignan and Reynold of Chatillon were brought before their conqueror. The atmosphere inside the pavilion was dictated strictly by high diplomacy and Islamic custom, standing in stark contrast to the carnage outside. Recognizing the physical exhaustion of the captive monarch, Saladin handed King Guy a goblet of iced rose water. Guy drank deeply to quench his severe dehydration, then passed the cup to Reynold. In the strict codes of Bedouin and regional hospitality, offering a captive food or drink constituted a binding guarantee of their life. Saladin immediately turned to his translator and stated explicitly that it was the king who had given Reynold the water, not the Sultan. By drawing this specific legal distinction, Saladin firmly denied Reynold the protection of guest right. Saladin's subsequent actions were not driven by spontaneous rage, but by calculated political justice. He confronted Reynold directly with his long history of unprovoked aggression, his raids on civilian caravans, and his repeated violations of negotiated truces. When Reynold responded with defiance, Saladin drew his sword and either struck the first blow himself or signaled his guards to execute the Lord of Ultra-Jordain on the spot. Witnessing this sudden execution, King Guy believed his own death was imminent and began to panic. Saladin quickly intervened to calm the terrified monarch. The Sultan assured Guy of his safety, stating that it was not the custom of kings to kill kings, and that Reynold had only died because of his absolute refusal to honor diplomatic boundaries. Guy's life was spared so he could be leveraged later as a highly valuable political hostage. While the secular nobility were treated according to the conventions of aristocratic ransom, Saladin applied a far more ruthless military calculus to the captured knights of the military orders. The Templars and Hospitallers were not merely feudal landowners. They were highly disciplined, professional religious zealots who formed the permanent standing military backbone of the Crusader states. Saladin knew that if these elite shock troops were ransomed, they would immediately return to garrison the Christian fortresses. To permanently cripple the operational capacity of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Sultan ordered the mass execution of hundreds of captured Templar and Hospitaller knights. This deliberate purge systematically eradicated the institutional military knowledge and veteran defensive capability of the Christian kingdom in a single afternoon. With its elite military orders eradicated, its secular nobility in chains, and its massive field army left dead on the arid slopes of the Horns of Hattin, the political structure of the Crusader states was irreversibly broken. Saladin had completely neutralized the defensive shield of the Christian kingdom. With the king captured and the army erased, the road to the most coveted prize in the world now lay completely defenseless. The destruction of the Crusader field army at the Horns of Hattin was not merely a localized military defeat, it was a geopolitical earthquake that triggered the immediate collapse of the First Kingdom of Jerusalem. Stripped of its professional military orders and secular nobility, the heavily fortified capital could not withstand a sustained blockade. On the 2nd of October, 1187 AD, after 88 years of Christian occupation, the city of Jerusalem formally surrendered to Saladin. The Sultan had achieved what no regional commander had managed since the First Crusade, reclaiming the Holy City not through a grinding war of attrition against impenetrable stone walls, but through a definitive masterclass in asymmetrical warfare. Hattin proved definitively that the unmatched shock power of European heavy armor could not overcome the fatal combination of severe dehydration, geographic isolation, and superior operational mobility. When the catastrophic news of the annihilated army and the captured True Cross finally reached Europe, the psychological shockwave was absolute. According to contemporary chronicles, Pope Urban III reportedly died of sudden grief upon hearing the dispatches. This profound trauma instantly galvanized the fractured monarchs of Western Europe, sparking the massive military mobilization known as the Third Crusade. Commanded by powerful figures such as Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, this new expedition would plunge the Levant into years of renewed, bloody conflict. Yet the absolute dominance the Crusader states had once enjoyed was permanently broken on that sun-baked Galilean plateau. The Battle of Hattin endures as a grim historical testament to the fatal consequences of prioritizing political pride over logistical reality. King Guy of Lusignan marched 20,000 men into a waterless wasteland to project strength to his vassals, only to lose his kingdom to a sovereign who understood that in the desert, the environment itself is the ultimate arbiter of war. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe to our channel to relive the great chapters of history together.